Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to this, which is the third in our Talking IP series. The topic for this afternoon is big data. I'm delighted to be joined by Ed Bullen from Telstra Purple, who is a data consultant, and we'll get more about Ed's involvement in big data and understand what is done with data and some of the trends that are being seen in the industry. And also equally delighted to be joined by my partner, Peter Wainman, who is an expert on various aspects of data. And we'll be chatting about some of the legal aspects as part of this event. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. First thing to say is you'll have heard a voice at the beginning, those of you who are right at the beginning, saying that the session's being recorded. That's so that it can be put up on our website for anybody that wants to hear again any elements of it, and those that couldn't make it. If you have any questions, we'll have a question and answer session at the end, but please do ask questions as we go along as well. Please use the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. We'll monitor those and address them either while we're talking or more likely at the end. When you leave, you'll be asked for feedback. Please do give us feedback. Let us know what we've done well, what we've done not so well. And actually also, if there are any other topics that you'd like to hear discussed, either in one of these Talking IP sessions, if they're IP related, or in any other webinar that Mills Reeve is running, please do let us know in the feedback at the end. All feedback is very welcome. And we're going to ask a couple of polls during the course of the webinar, so that we can get a feel for what people's views are out there and what levels of activity we've got going. So moving right to the beginning then, I'm going to introduce Ed Bullen, who, as I say, is a guest. Ed, you're with Telstra Purple. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. So, yeah, my name's Ed Bullen. I work for a company called Telstra Purple. And we're the consulting services arm of Telstra, which are a large Australian telecoms group, if you haven't heard of them. And I lead the technical consulting team for our data and analytics practice in EMEA. And this is a group of data scientists and data engineers, and we consult on a paid basis for our clients. So that's our business model. And I mean, very briefly, the sort of things that we do, we can be engaged by companies at a strategic level, so providing guidance to senior management for their company's data strategy, or we work on a project basis. So quite often we would develop a blueprint with a company for a data or AI or machine learning project and build a rapid proof of concept for them, and then maybe deliver the full solution afterwards. And finally, we do just skills augmentation, so placing expert skills within an organization, data scientists, data engineers. So we cover all industry sectors, everything from banking, insurance, legal, travel and transport. And across, I guess, all those different industry sectors, we're seeing a huge amount of change in terms of the way data and AI and machine learning is being used in these organizations. And there's some common themes there. I guess we can talk more about those later.
Yeah. So Ed, how did you get into data? What's your background?
Gosh, so my background, I guess, after leaving university, I actually did engineering as a degree, but I learned a bit of programming, and I joined a reinsurance company in the early 90s, and that was where I first learned about how in the real world, in the commercial world, people were using large databases to manage a company's transactions. So looking after the ledger, keeping track of customers, clients, and the insurance industry was quite forward thinking. Even in those days, they were building complex statistical models. We didn't call it machine learning in those days, but building complex statistical models to analyze risk, to set insurance premiums and work out which were the most profitable business sectors to go after. So that's where I started. And I guess over many years, my career developed, but I stayed very much in the database world. Eventually worked for a large tech company called Oracle. And really, I think in the 2010s, things really started to change. So companies started to move from just using data platforms for running the business. Then we saw the big data revolution, at which point people started to do, data didn't just become something that you had to use to run your business. Data became part of the business, and the value, and then people started to see value in data. So not just processing your own data to do a profit and loss account, but maybe, for instance, we work with a healthcare company that built an algorithm on the data that they have from their clients, and then they can sell access to the data back to those same clients. So they've built a whole new business model out of the data that they have possession of.
Sure. And I guess a lot of what you're doing then is helping people develop those models out from based on the data that they've got. What are the sources typically? You mentioned insurance, banks, the legal sector, healthcare and research, and travel and transport as sectors you're active in. What are the sources? What are the sorts of data that you're seeing your clients working with?
So I guess the most sort of exciting and innovative areas, probably healthcare and bioinformatics. I mean, they're really at the forefront of this. And obviously there's some quite complicated compliance and legislative things to consider, but the way healthcare has developed based on what can be done by analyzing huge volumes of data about people and their health outcomes has really revolutionized healthcare. So the experts who know what they want to do with that data are usually embedded in these organizations, and really where people like myself and our organization come in is just helping them implement the infrastructure and the strategy to do that processing. But as well as healthcare, I mean, some more sort of some simpler examples. So even in, say, the real estate sector, so we work with an organisation that has sort of a number of different investments in real estate assets, and they've realised, instead of just collecting individual bits of data on how their different investments are performing, they can look at the group as a whole and also join that data with publicly available data sets like geolocation data and socioeconomic data. And then they can start to see which assets are underperforming or overperforming in a particular area based on their sort of location, for instance, and compared to their peers that have the same profile. And they can also use that to target good and bad investments. Maybe this one's underperforming, this looks like a good bet to invest in, and so on. So that's another example. Yeah. And I guess the point is that they're using other people's data, bringing it together, and then suddenly the value of and they're creating the value out of someone else's data in doing that.
Okay. And where are they getting that data from?
Well, more often than not, they're getting that from their clients or their business partners. So I think it's very interesting, and I'm on a day-to-day basis, I'm involved in just the technical implementation, if you like. But what you can see is, without realizing it, we're all our organizations, we're all sharing data with each other just to operate. And so this business-to-business communication means that more and more businesses have a lot more data about the businesses they interact with.
Yeah.
But there's also public data sets available which are useful.
Yeah, it's interesting. This chimes from our last Talking IP session, where Andy Yeaman of Consiris, who are a fintech in the shipping insurance industry, were using data that came from various shipping insurance providers to price insurance products for their clientele, which sounds very similar to some of what you're describing in terms of data coming from a number of different sources, and an analysis of that combined data providing some real value.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm trying to think of some other good examples. Well, so I was in a conversation yesterday, which I thought was very interesting, and it was to do with a large telco. I think I should make it clear, it definitely wasn't Telstra, so I can talk about it freely without naming them. And they had a problem with 5G in that they need to upgrade all their infrastructure for 5G processing, but they don't have a clear view of their own inventory of masts. Not quite sure why that is, and it's not Telstra. And they had the idea that they could use Google Street Map, and by processing Google Street Map for the whole country, they could look for pictures of masts and identify which ones looked like their masts, and then they would know where those masts were and be able to identify the type of mast. However, they then ran into the problem of trying to understand the Google terms of service for using that data, and that's really how I got involved in this conversation, because they were trying to ship that responsibility out to a third party to do the processing for them. So I thought that was interesting on a number of points, because first of all, there are some terms and conditions, but trying to understand those terms and conditions in terms of what you can do with the data and what you can't do, it was quite opaque. And the other thing that interested me was that data that has that value came from Google just going around taking pictures of buildings that are in the public domain. So that's a great example of how you can just go and process data. And that information wasn't theirs, but the act of processing it has made it theirs, and they now have a sort of a legal and a commercial hold over it.
Yeah, and I guess we'll get on quite shortly into what sort of hold that might be and how that works. And are you seeing? I mean, what in terms of trends that you're seeing? I know that in the government's AI sector deal, which was part of the industrial strategy, they sort of foresaw a situation where there was going to be much more activity where businesses collaborated to produce large amounts of big data. Is that a trend you're seeing at all?
Well, I don't know about collaboration. Not a huge amount of collaboration. I think a lot of the collaboration happens, unfortunately, more just tactically on a needs must basis. So it tends to be business driven. You know, we need to connect to each other and share this information because. So yeah, that would tend to be more the trend that we see, and then out of that, you then get a lot of challenges in terms of how you do that sharing of information, and the boundary, handing that data over and then knowing what happens to it is rarely clear. Yes, and so there's a lot of detail in terms of how you set up an organization with a structure and the best practices so that data can be managed. And if you sign up to some terms and conditions with a third party, you know that within your own systems you're adhering to those terms. There's quite a lot in that.
Yeah.
And Ed, sorry, jumping in on that point, but that when you talk about that, the kind of interface, and there's the terms, presumably you're talking about both. There's the question of how that works from a technical point of view in terms of that, the bit that you would do in terms of the interface and how the data flows across that interface, and then the legal bit, the contractual bit, the terms that apply to that. And they're both kind of key to, because as you described at the outset, a lot of the opportunities come from data sharing, and inherently in data sharing, you've then got the issue around both those interfaces and how they're managed both technically and legally, contractually. That's what we see on the contractual side of things. Does that sound right to you as well?
Yes, it does, and I don't get involved in the contractual side, or have a great deal of understanding about it, I have to say. But in terms of once data has entered an organisation, keeping track of what you're doing with that data, the larger your organisation is, the more of a complicated task that is. So putting systems in place so that you know as this data evolves, what its provenance is, and can you be sure that only the right people have access to it at the right level, and it's not being passed on in ways that it shouldn't be, is actually quite a difficult thing to implement.
Okay, that's interesting. I just wondered, actually, at that point, it might be a good time to get a feel for the audience and the involvement that our audience has in big data. So at that point, Lizzie, could we have our first poll question, please? So people out there, are you involved in working with large amounts of data? And if the answer to that is yes, are you working with data that's derived from more than one source? Fantastic. So that's interesting. So actually, 62% is quite a substantial proportion, and of those 62%, pretty much, well, everybody, in fact, is working with data that's derived from more than one source. So that's interesting, and sort of reflects, I think, Ed, what you're saying, that's increasingly common. So,
am I allowed to pinch another question at that point? Because it sort of follows on from that point, but it partly triggered by what Ed said earlier about, you made a comment about, well, we didn't call it machine learning then, and I'm interested to know, because people have been talking about big data. Obviously, there are lots of opportunities in it at the moment, but I've been involved in webinars to do with big data on and off for, I don't know, 10 years or more. And I'm interested to know, is it more of a thing now? Is it just that there's more data and there are more opportunities, and so it's and the nature of those opportunities is shifting? And what's hot in it at the moment?
Yes, so I think we're finally at a stage where the hype is behind us, and people have almost got bored of the hype, and now people are looking at real things that you can do with it. It's matured to that extent. So to oversimplify it slightly, but you could say that machine learning is just applying statistical methods to data. And I guess we've been through maybe 50 years of those statistical methods being refined to being easier to apply computationally, and at the same time the computational power increasing to exponentially, genuinely exponentially. So what that means now is that it's simple enough and cheap enough to apply machine learning to simple clerical tasks, so processing documents, for instance, and extracting key pieces of information out of those documents and deciding whether that part of a document fits into some classification or another. So a huge amount of kind of white collar work can be automated through that type of process. I also mentioned that Google example, so that's on the sort of more rarefied high end of what you can do with machine learning and AI. But 5 years ago, that would be something that a research department at a kind of a major corporation would have to do. But these days, even quite small organizations have access to that via sort of packaged API service, packaged interfaces provided by these cloud vendors like Google and Amazon and Microsoft and so on. And that's a lot of what we do. We sort of help set up, not just large organizations, but small, medium-sized businesses now have access to this sort of technology. So yeah, absolutely, it's a real thing now. So we've got over the sort of the robots taking over the world, and I think people have realized that actually machine learning is a little bit more simple and work a day than that, and it's now accessible, and you can start using it for automating tasks and getting enhanced insight on your data. Yeah, so it's endemic everywhere now, I would say.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, and all based on ever increasing volumes of data. Yes,
that's right. And I imagine that you're starting to see it in your industry. I mean, you work in an industry that runs off huge amounts of information, and I imagine 10 years ago the concept of processing all those kind of complex what if you're not in the legal profession, you would call it unstructured data, but you probably think it's very structured. The idea of processing that programmatically might have seemed impossible. But I mean, are you starting?
Yeah, no, you are beginning to see, I guess, machine learning applications turning up in things like document review. So a lot of the more mundane work in the legal profession is beginning to be able to be automated. I wouldn't say that the uptake has been huge so far, but we are seeing it. So I know, for instance, that our property team have performed a due diligence exercise on a large number of leases for a commercial property client, where they reviewed those leases automatically and were able to work out which ones had which clauses in, rather than having a team of paralegals have to pore over them. So yeah, we're beginning to see that a fair bit.
I think certainly in as Mark says, due diligence and disclosure. So due diligence is precursor to transactions, and disclosure as part of a big dispute. Those are particularly hot areas for it, and where far from demoralising junior lawyers by taking away their jobs, on the whole, it means that people don't get stuck doing things that are pretty menial and boring, and frankly that the computers do at least as accurately as the paralegals at midnight. So my hunch is that there'll be more and more of a drive. I mean, our innovation folks are looking at it more and more, but my hunch is that the clients will demand it, that for certain sorts of projects that they won't want to pay for people to be doing it.
So it'll probably show my age, but one of the first things I did when I became a lawyer over 30 years ago was to spend 6 months working 12-hour days in a grotty room in a factory in St Helens, poring through documents, looking for a single word, looking for the word guardian. And every document I saw that had the word guardian in, flagging it so that someone more senior could decide if it was relevant for a dispute. And I don't think any of our staff are going to be disappointed they don't have to do that anymore.
Exactly. So there are many tasks out there that are ripe for automation in that way. We're seeing that. Yeah. So a completely different sector, working with a company that leases out hire equipment, and they've moved, because of the sort of current economic situation, they've moved from hiring new equipment to looking at their second-hand equipment and realizing they've got a huge backlog of very valuable second-hand specialist equipment that they're selling on the open market, but they don't really know they've not really thought about it before, but they don't actually know how to price it effectively because they don't have an inventory of it. So they've got millions and millions of pounds worth of equipment that they need to put into some sort of inventory so they can sell it. And they've realized that what they can do is they can just take a picture of the piece of equipment and use vision processing to work out what the serial number and the model number is, and then they can pull that into a salesman's database. But to do that in an automated way, all the salesmen were getting fed up. They'd have to go to the warehouse, look at the label, write it down on a piece of paper, go back to a database and type it in. So being able to automate those sort of things, it's not the AI vision of the future that you might have seen in films, but that's absolutely happening every day now. But at the other end of the scale, it's building an algorithm that you can pay people to access. I mean, that is the very exciting kind of high-end side of it, and I think people will start to do that as well.
Yeah.
So I guess the example that I've been involved with a healthcare company, that because it's receiving data from all its different healthcare centres, it was able to build an algorithm to do with health outcomes, basically, and sell access to that algorithm back to its own clients. So that's being a very clever use of the data that you're in possession of. And most industries are in possession of a lot of data now. Yeah. So if you're, I've heard of one legal company, I think if you're in possession of a lot of data, you could just process those legal cases, I guess, or you could build a model to automate that and sell some sort of service on the basis of it.
Sure. And actually, I guess you talked there about being a possession of data, and earlier you talked about ownership, I think, and that's one of the things that we probably ought to talk a little bit about, because we need to talk about some of the legal aspects of this. It's a legal session after all, and I guess that actually looking at how data is protected, and all you talk about ownership, but actually, what does that mean? Data itself there's no property right. Data is protected. It can be kept as confidential. And I think, in fact, you look at most businesses that have large amounts of data, maintain it as confidential themselves. That's much harder when you're sharing it with other businesses. There's some aspects of databases which could be protected by copyright, but copyright doesn't strictly protect databases in the way it might. There is an EU right called database right, which prevents against the extraction of substantial parts of a database. The problem is that subsistence of database right is difficult to establish, because not only do you need to have the data, but you need to have spent time verifying. You need to have invested in verifying the data, and actually, increasingly, databases aren't databases where each data point has been verified. They're collected automatically, and there's actually probably no need to verify. Would you say that's probably right?
Gosh.
Depends on the data. I'm guessing would be my hunch is that there are probably somewhere that where verification is defer to you, Ed, but somewhere verification is just not relevant if the data is what it is, and in others, absolutely, it would need to be verified as part of that process. But I guess it depends what verify means as well. So I'll butt out as a non-technical person.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to ask. I mean, I think it depends on the business process, and that in a way, it's not a technical question. It's a case of the organisation has to decide what needs to be. If you pretend there was no technology involved at all, and you were just doing it on paper, what would you have to do to say that yes, this information is verified?
Yeah. And
then once you know what that is, you're just applying that in an automated way in technology.
Yeah, and that has historically been the difficulty. But that gives ownership. I mean, when you talk about owning data, actually, ownership is really about possession. It's about keeping it under cover, and where you've got multiple parties providing data and contributing to the same database, actually, there you need some sort of, going forward, it's likely what we'll need to see is some sort of agreement as to how that data is shared and what use can be made of it. And that's something the government's sort of addressed, or was addressed in the I talked earlier about the sector deal for the AI industry, which is part of the industrial strategy, and there was a concept of what they call a data trust. And in fact, what a data trust is it's not strictly a trust. It's a series of different proposals for structures under which multiple data control. I'm not going to use the word data controllers, because that's, as we'll get on to a minute, that's got a very specific meaning in data protection law, but a number of contributors that had in their possession data or were providing data could collaborate together to share that data and control how it might be used. There was a suggestion that, I guess, in very large databases where you've got a large number of collaborators contributing to the database, you might even have a special purpose vehicle incorporated to sort of control the data and handle licensing. But otherwise, it's a number of different commercial structures where businesses could agree how they would contribute data to a database and how the use of that database would be controlled. And I guess there are potentially examples there, for instance, in health informatics. If you've got a number of trusts contributing to a database, the trusts may want to agree between themselves how that data was controlled.
Sorry, I was going to say, is it fair to say, Mark, that at the moment the concept of a data trust has been around in terms of something that you could definitively say, yes, that is a data trust as it's been, as it was intended to be in line with the rules. There are not lots of examples that have.
No, I mean, and you know, our experience is that we've talked to a few clients who've been involved in preliminary discussions which might lead to a data trust. We've provided initial advice in relation to a couple, but actually what we haven't seen is anyone actually go ahead and put in place that legal structure to control large databases and collaboratively contributed databases. So yeah, it's something that was highlighted in the sector deal. I'm trying to think, the sector deal is probably 3 years old now. So yeah, it's an idea in the sector deal. It does seem like, you know, at some point there is going to need to be an agreement how large volumes of data get exploited, where you've got multiple contributors. But I think at the moment it's still something that people are thinking about and not yet. We haven't seen anyone take the plunge.
Yeah, I mean, what I do see is most of the organisations that we work with put a huge amount of effort into being able to prove the provenance and the data lineage of the data that they are processing on their systems. And that is a surprisingly difficult thing to do. But being able to catalogue your data and keep track of where it arrived, where it came from, and how it's changed along the way is an important thing to do. Because then if you can do that, then you can apply whatever legislation, regulations, or strategy you need to do on top of it. That is a very difficult thing to do. So I see a lot, so at my level, I see a lot of organizations putting a lot of time and effort into that, and that's kind of really the area that I work in, sort of advising in that area. And I guess one of the main drivers for that is probably you know, the leaders of these organizations are probably realizing that the world is changing, and they're going to need to be able to deal with this as the legislation becomes clearer and more defined.
Yeah, and actually, one other thing it's worth flagging from a sort of legislative point of view is that the position in relation to protection of databases becomes even less clear after the 1st of January, because, as I said, database right is a facet of EU legislation, and unless there's a deal between now and the 1st of January, it appears that although we will have a UK database right, that an owner of a UK database right in a new database created after the 1st of January will not have a right in the EU. It won't be reciprocally recognised, and an EU 27 business that has a database right in the EU may not have a right that it can be enforced in the UK. So hopefully there'll be an agreement, but there's a bit more confusion there. I'm conscious that time's moving on. I want to allow some time for questions and answers at the end. So we've hinted a couple of times at the elephant in the room, which you get to with a lot of the databases, and Ed, you've talked about health informatics quite a lot. So before I start talking, ask Peter some questions about data protection, GDPR. Let's go with the second poll, please. Okay, so you could let us know, those of you, whether you've had experienced constraints from the legal or regulatory reasons, such as GDPR, in a way of using data in a project. Okay, there's a pattern beginning to emerge here, which is, I guess, what we might have expected.
I'm sort of perhaps encouraged / pleasantly surprised about the small number of 5s on the seriousness of index.
Yes, I guess that's right, and I guess it depends what a 1 to 5 means, but five means that projects weren't stopped. There's only a couple there, so that is, I guess, encouraging. On the other hand, what we're looking at there is quite a lot where it's a 3 or a 4. That's a third of
I was going to say, well, I can think of some projects where data issues have meant the project didn't go ahead because people just couldn't figure out how they could data protection issues, and that people couldn't figure out how to get around, whether it's something to do with compliance with data protection obligations, or where the data is going to be stored, or whatever. But I suppose that probably reflects what the ICO ought to say, which is data protection shouldn't stop you doing things. It sits alongside big data and the opportunities, and it overlays it, but it's not an inhibitor. It's just a factor in how you manage it. So
obviously, I mean, we've talked about health informatics examples, and clearly that's one of the most significant areas where big data is being used. Anonymization, pseudo-anonymization is often suggested as a way around that. Peter, do you want to comment on how well that might work, and what are the issues there?
So people may or may not know, but so the headline rules are that if you can identify somebody from the data in the data set, or the data that's in the data set plus other data you're likely to be able to lay your hands on, then it's personal data subject to the GDPR regulations. So if you take out some of the identifiers, but there's still enough left in the data set, or by the time you've combined that with the other data you can get your hands on, it would still identify somebody. It's still subject to the data protection rules. So I've heard it said a few times, and be interested if Ed's got a view on this, by technical folks, that as data sets grow, it becomes more and more difficult to genuinely anonymize something, on the basis that the richer the data set, even if you've taken the name out for argument's sake, by the time you've combined all of the other things, they'd be so unique as to specifically identify a person. I don't know, Ed, if you've got a view on that, how much data you need to take out of a data set, for example, in a health context, before it would be genuinely anonymous.
Exactly. I mean, you've pinpointed the problem, and the point is, it's the richness of the data rather than the volume. So if you think about that, if you've got an individual record relating to an individual, even if it hasn't got their name or address, as you make the data richer and richer and richer with more features about this individual, as soon as you've got something like a location or a postcode, in there, eventually it'll narrow down to a very few number of individuals. And broadly, and I tend to follow the direction of people who specialize in the regulations about how GDPR and so on are applied. But broadly, as soon as you start aggregating the data, then things become a lot easier. So instead of like dealing with individual records of data, but summary measures against groups of people, if you can work with that data, then that's a lot less controversial, because it doesn't relate to an individual. But yes, just encrypting or anonymizing records about individuals is not enough in itself.
And that's been my experience as well. I have to say that a lot of times when looking at it, people would sort of like to not have to think about the data protection rules, so would like it to be anonymous, but it isn't really, because actually the trouble is, often the problem is that they'd still really like to be able to use it, whatever intelligence they get out of the analytics they're going to put it through, in relation to some particular people. And the second that's the case, of course, you're going to need to be able to de-anonymize it. In other words, it would have been pseudonymized, in which case the rules will have applied, albeit that you can potentially, it's a useful way of keeping the data secure to pseudonymize it. It doesn't stop it being personal data. So I mean, generally I'd say that often what we see is that you have to sort of, unless it is aggregated in the way you describe, often you have to assume that the rules do apply, and then actually just work out how you then comply with those rules, because as the ICO would say, complying with the rules is not necessarily rocket science. It's about transparency and doing what people would expect you to do with their data. So that's often where we see these things playing out.
And in these sort of situations, Peter, where you've got large amounts of say, medical data, which might have been anonymized or pseudonymized, does that impact on who the data controller is, and who is the data controller?
Yeah, that's a perennial problem in identifying who's the data controller, particularly where you might, for example, in the context of product development, where I'll take an example that when the ICO wrote its big data paper a few years back, probably about the same time as the data trusts one that we were talking about earlier, but they were talking about the Google DeepMind case and whether or not Google were acting as a data controller in that case, because they were using it for their own purposes as opposed to for the hospital. And for those that don't remember that case, that was broadly DeepMind developing the Streams app by using a load of patient data from the hospital. And were they doing it for the hospital so that hospital could provide care, or were they doing it for their own purposes to improve their product? In one case they're a processor, and in another they're a controller, and that as a problem we see in a lot of technology contexts where is this just part of the service that the technology provider is providing to their customer, or are they really doing this for their own purposes so that they can get a better product? And that's not always easy to unpick. is the simple short answer.
Yeah. So case by case basis, but a difficult question to answer. Yeah, it strikes me actually that we're talking here in the context of big data, but from the data protection point of view, is there anything about big data that makes the data protection issues different from, I hesitate to call it small data, but from smaller databases? Are there legal differences from your point of view?
No. In essence, no. And the legal framework's exactly the same. I think the only difference is that probably comes back to what we were just describing about the issues around anonymity and so on. That if you've got a lot of data, it becomes much more difficult to anonymize it. But the legal framework that overlays both is exactly the same. So it's sort of normal rules apply, as it were, with big data, which is part of the problem in the sense that applying those normal rules to a very big volume of data that may have come from different sources can be tricky.
Yeah. And I guess actually something else that strikes me then that may be potentially difficult, and it's maybe something where there's a legal answer and a technical answer. So I guess it's one for both of you, is that how do you go about complying or ensuring you can comply with sort of transparency, privacy notice obligations you get in relation to personal data when you've got large volumes of data?
Who's going to go first?
Well, I'll answer it from my point of view. And really that comes back to my point I was saying earlier about how organizations put a lot of time and effort, and it's quite challenging in terms of keeping track of the data that they're processing and cataloging it. And that is just the hard yards of putting in place best practice systems with good housekeeping, cataloging the data, having an architecture so that you can only change the data in certain ways in certain places, and that's being tracked. And what that means is that if you have to unpick that data based on, I guess, the right to be forgotten or something like that, you are able to track where that data is with certainty at the different points in your organization. So does that answer the question from a technical point of view?
It seems to me. And okay. Peter, what about from the legal point of view? Is there anything to add to that?
Well, not a huge amount, other than to say often the problem is just that the privacy notice, as we described earlier, that often the source of the data is not necessarily where the data ends up, and so the source of the data collection point where the privacy notice usually comes in can be operating in a very different work stream to the people who are going to ultimately make use of the data further down the line, and making sure that those bits are joined up. And that was, again, actually a question, sorry to keep asking you, but a question I was going to ask, but making sure that the people writing the privacy notice at the outset are aware of the full journey of that data as sort of currently planned, and make sure that they've accounted for that to the extent they need to, which needn't be exhaustive, but needs to be compliant. Is a problem. I don't know if Ed's experience, my experience is that the legal and the technical work streams perhaps don't work as closely or as joined up away as they might always.
Yes, that's true, and they are when I've been involved in them, there can be quite disconnected processes. So the legal and compliance process is quite kind of paper-based and can be quite sort of static. And so separately, you might get someone such as myself come into an organization and help them define this platform and this way of processing that meets those requirements. And then, but then obviously IT systems and processing requirements change and evolve all the time, and linking that legal and compliance department with the technology department and the application groups, that is a challenge, and it's more of an organizational challenge than a technical challenge, because I say the technical methods, architectures, blueprints, and so on for solving that problem are there. It's a lot of work. I mean, dealing with things like GDPR and the right to be forgotten and anonymity. There's a lot of technical hoops you've got to jump through, but there are tried and trusted ways of doing that. But you've got to bring those two very different domains and specialisms together so that they're working in concert all the time, not just one, just not one point in time. That is the challenge. Yeah.
And I guess the issue partly on that is that, as you say, the opportunities around data and technology and things are shifting, and so sometimes you're working with an old data set. So what you want to be able to do with it's moved on, and yet the privacy notice you've collected it under may be old, or the contract that you received it under is old, and so those things may need to be refreshed. But I think that's how it is.
Yeah, that is how it is to an extent, but more forward-thinking organizations are realizing that what they need, instead of like a paper-based agreement, they need a live catalog and a live data dictionary. And if you map your organizational processes to a live view of your cataloged data and its life cycle, provenance, and so on, then that is the way to solve that problem, and people are moving in that direction. Yeah.
Talk about moving in directions. I'm conscious we've only got 10 minutes, 12 minutes left, and there are some questions coming through. So, Ed, we're talking here about large amounts of data which people are investing in gathering together. They've clearly got value. And I just want, at that point, I think let's ask the third poll question, see whether people in the audience are recognizing the value of data and the algorithms that are derived from them. So has anyone out there come across organizations who are sort of formally recognizing the value of their data assets or algorithms on their balance sheets or elsewhere? And is that something that's likely to become more common? Well, that's really interesting.
Confirms what we'd suspected, but
it confirms what we suspect. I mean, I'm going to say that from my point of view, I'm pleasantly surprised to see 6 people saying yes to the first question, and not at all surprised to see 90% of people think it's going to become more likely.
Agreed.
I mean, I don't know whether either of you, Ed or Peter, have either of you seen businesses that sort of formally recognise the value of their data or algorithms on their anywhere in their accounts?
But I thought that the sort of the ratio was interesting, because that instinctively is about what it feels like to me. So, I mean, obviously, I've been talking about the kind of more interesting and innovative, exciting aspects of what come across data, but probably 80% of it is more a case of it's broken, it's not fast enough, we can't get access to this. People are just dealing with that most of the time. But then you've got the more forward-thinking, innovative companies that are realizing actually this data in itself has a value and it's increasing the value of our company. So yeah, we're just at the start of that. So interesting results.
And I think there's a parallel here with the way that particularly some of the large US tech corporations started to recognize the value of their IP assets, perhaps 20, 25 years ago now, whereas they previously hadn't been recognized formally on balance sheets. And you've now got corporations where IP is one of the most significant assets of a business. And we may well see that happen with data, in my view. Peter, are you seeing any of your clients recognizing the value of their data formally?
Not knowingly, as it were. I wonder the extent to which the people who have said yes, whether or not those data assets and algorithms have been recognised as part of the value of some software, for example. Yeah. So it's effectively a sort of an IP asset of which the data and the algorithm is a part of that asset. But I don't know, that's guessing.
Well, on that, let's move on and answer some of the questions. We've got a few coming in. So let's start then with the first of these questions, which is a question about I think database right and whether we're seeing applications for preliminary injunctions where there's unlawful extraction of databases. And I guess the answer to that is you do see that in some cases, but I don't think it's the majority. And I think again that sort of reflects what you see in most intellectual property infringement cases. I think where you'll see, I mean, because in the UK to get an interim injunction, you need to prove that damages aren't an adequate remedy, and a lot of times databases that are being unlawfully extracted are databases that are being licensed. And if you're licensing it, then almost by default, then the damage can be reflected in damages, and you don't qualify for an interim injunction. I think the cases you see where it is happening are for instance in sort of aggregation of data from things like airline websites or booking websites where bots, and this may well be the most prevalent sort of way of infringing database rights, is where people are using bots to gather large volumes of data by making individual visits, obtaining single datums or small amounts of data in one go, and then aggregating it. So I think the answer to that question is we're not seeing a huge amount of interim applications, but we're not seeing a lot of database infringement rights claimed in the UK. I think it's quite surprising how few actions we see in the UK for infringement of database rights or copyright in databases.
As you said, Mark, is it fair to say then it's usually it's wrapped where it is? It's wrapped up with a claim with something else, a breach of contract claim. Or
yeah, nearly always with a breach of contract, and then you get into there's European legislation about whether you can actually in a contract restrict the extraction of data, and there's a Ryanair case where that's key. So it's complex, I think, is the answer. But no, not a huge volume of applications for interim relief. Question for Ed. Lots of effort going into data origins, tracking and change management. Is part of the problem that organisations are holding too much intermediate data rather than generating what they need just in time from raw data sets and instead tracking the code that produces the outputs?
Yes, that's a very well thought out question. There's a lot of insight in that question. So yes, that is the challenge. Is the problem that organizations are holding too much intermediate data? You could put it that way, or you could say that organizations have a need to hold intermediate data. So if you've got a very small, simple organization, then yes, you can just have raw data, process to access, done. But larger organizations are very complex, and everyone will need a store and a copy of data in different states, or at least they will say they do. And then you have different lines of businesses and different units within those lines of businesses with different requirements. And so absolutely, that is the challenge. The nirvana, and this was part of the original big data hype. I mean, one of the ideas that was just that you just have this raw data, immutable, so can't be changed, immutable raw data, and then you just process to see what you want to see out of it. Reality is never that tidy or nice. So yes, that is the problem. I would argue that, being realistic, most organizations will need a few post-processed versions of that data through their organization. And I think the trick is not to get rid of it, but keep it under control.
Good. That's a pretty thorough answer to what I thought was quite a difficult question. I hope it answers the asker's question. And then a couple of what looked to me like very frightening legal questions, but fortunately I've got an expert in the room. Peter, a couple for you, I think. With Brexit looming, Privacy Shield's been rejected by the ECJ after Schrems 2. Legal transfer from the UK to the US, how do you go about that now?
But given the amount of time, most people are signing standard contractual clauses. The unfortunate thing we've now got is we've got some standard contractual clauses for transferring data from the EU to countries outside the EU, including the US. There are 3 issues with those standard contractual clauses. Post Schrems 2, there's a question mark over whether or not they're really good enough, full stop. And certainly there's some additional guidance around doing your due diligence on where the data's going, where nobody quite knows what level of due diligence to do, and we're kind of waiting for better guidance on that from the powers that be. The second problem is that the standard contractual clauses were written before the GDPR, so they don't really meet the standards of the GDPR anyway. So they're kind of we were already making do before Schrems 2. And the third issue is for Brexit. Post-Brexit, we don't have our own UK standard contractual clauses, so we're going to have to make do with the EU's ones for now, which are mostly talking about transfers from the EU to outside the EU, and obviously we won't be in the EU, so the standard contractual clauses are not a brilliant fit for UK-US transfers. So on various levels there, the standard contractual clauses are suboptimal, but the best we've got, and my experience is most people are signing standard contractual clauses and making a judgment about how far to go on the due diligence and other stuff, depending on risk. It was a rather long answer, sorry.
No, that's fine, great, thank you. And finally, and we'll make this the last one before we thank everybody. Heard a lot about right to privacy. Can you clarify, is there a right to an explanation under GDPR? You know, why does a machine learning model produce a particular decision? Do data subjects have that right?
Not per se are those sort of. So assuming we are talking about personal data, because otherwise it wouldn't be relevant at all. If there is some personal data and a machine learning model produces a particular decision as a result of that personal data, then there are some provisions around decision making as a result of automated processing. So the individual would have the ability to require that automated decision if it was made solely on the basis of the automated decision to challenge that effectively. And also there's the subject access right. So in other words, tell me what data you've got about me and what you're doing with it, which would include some degree of explanation. But there isn't per se a right to an explanation quite as framed in the question, but there are ways for the individual to effectively interrogate that use if it affects them, if the decision making affects them.
Great, thank you. We're at 5 o'clock very nearly, so I'm going to say thank you very much indeed, Ed. That's been really interesting. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join us this evening. Peter, thank you very much. Always comforting to have a real expert on GDPR on hand. And thank you very much to everybody who's attended. Thank you for the questions. I hope that's been interesting. As I say, this is part of a regular series of Talking IP slots. The next one will be in January. If you're interested in being on the mailing list for that and you're not already, then do let us know. And finally, before signing off, when you leave, there will be a feedback opportunity. Please, as I said at the beginning, give us your feedback. What went well? Did you enjoy it? What was good? What was bad? And what else would you like to hear us talking about IP, or Mills Reeve talking about the law generally? Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everybody.